There's a moment that often confuses people after the end of a deeply painful relationship. They watch someone who seemed completely unaffected by betrayal suddenly become increasingly reactive months later. At first glance, it doesn't make sense. If they were willing to walk away so easily, why would they appear unsettled long after the relationship has ended? Today, we're going to explore one possible psychological explanation for this pattern, not because it happens in every relationship or with every person who shows narcissistic traits, but because many survivors describe noticing something remarkably similar. Sometimes, the emotional consequences of betrayal don't appear immediately. They emerge gradually after the immediate advantages of the decision begin fading and the deeper psychological realities become impossible to avoid. To understand why, we first need to examine what often makes a relationship with a highly empathic person different from many other relationships. A deeply empathic partner frequently offers something that extends beyond affection alone. They tend to invest significant emotional energy into understanding another person's inner world. Rather than reacting only to outward behavior, they often search for the fears, insecurities, or painful experiences that might explain it. They may remain patient through periods of inconsistency, believing that compassion and stability can help create a healthier relationship over time. This quality can become one of the relationship's greatest strengths. It can also become one of its greatest vulnerabilities. When one person repeatedly extends understanding while the other repeatedly avoids accountability, an unhealthy imbalance can slowly develop. Over time, extraordinary patience may begin feeling ordinary. Repeated forgiveness may become expected rather than appreciated. Acts of loyalty that once seemed remarkable gradually become part of the background of the relationship. Human psychology has a tendency to underestimate what appears permanent. We notice what changes. We often overlook what quietly remains. That tendency can affect relationships just as easily as any other part of life. When someone repeatedly believes another person will always stay, the perceived cost of hurtful behavior may gradually decrease. Not necessarily because they consciously intend to cause harm, but because familiarity creates an illusion of permanence. Then something changes. The empath reaches a limit, not because they stop caring, because they recognize that caring cannot substitute for mutual effort. This turning point is often surprisingly quiet. There may be no dramatic confrontation, no final attempt to convince, no desperate argument. Instead, emotional energy begins moving inward rather than outward. The focus shifts from changing the relationship to rebuilding the self. That shift can be difficult for the other person to recognize at first. They may assume the distance is temporary. They may believe another apology, another promise, or another emotional conversation will restore the familiar dynamic. Sometimes that assumption proves incorrect. When the relationship genuinely ends, something important disappears alongside it, not only companionship, predictability, the expectation that someone would continue offering understanding despite repeated disappointments. For some individuals with strong narcissistic traits, this loss can create a profound disruption because the relationship had become woven into how they experienced reassurance, validation, or emotional stability. The issue isn't simply losing one partner, it's losing a familiar source of psychological reinforcement without having fully appreciated its role while it was present. This is where many observers become confused. They expect emotional consequences to appear immediately. Instead, they often emerge later. Why? Because the first stage after separation is frequently filled with distraction, new goals, new relationships, new routines, new opportunities to avoid reflection. Distraction can delay emotional awareness. It cannot always eliminate it. As ordinary life settles, comparisons may quietly begin. Future relationships may not contain the same level of patience. New partners may establish boundaries much earlier. They may question inconsistencies instead of explaining them away. Behaviors that were once tolerated are now challenged almost immediately. Only then does the uniqueness of the previous relationship become easier to recognize. Ironically, appreciation often arrives after access has disappeared. That doesn't necessarily lead to healthy insight. Some people respond with genuine self-reflection. Others respond by searching for another relationship that recreates the same emotional dynamic without addressing the behaviors that caused the original relationship to end. That difference becomes the foundation for everything that follows, because the real question isn't whether someone misses the person they betrayed. The deeper question is whether the loss becomes an opportunity for honest self-examination or simply another cycle of trying to replace what was lost without understanding why it disappeared in the first place. If the end of the relationship creates emotional discomfort, the next question becomes far more important. What determines whether that discomfort leads to growth or simply to repetition? The answer lies in how a person explains the loss to themselves. Psychologists have long recognized that the stories people tell themselves about painful experiences shape what they learn from them. Two individuals can experience the same breakup and walk away with entirely different conclusions. One might ask, what patterns in my own behavior contributed to this outcome? The other might ask, why do people always leave me? Those questions may sound similar, but they lead in completely different directions. The first invites self-examination. The second often searches for explanations outside the self. When someone consistently protects their self-image from uncomfortable truths, real change becomes much more difficult, not because change is impossible, but because lasting change usually begins with the willingness to tolerate discomfort. That discomfort isn't punishment. It's information. It points toward the places where growth is needed. Avoiding it may provide temporary relief, but it often leaves the underlying pattern untouched. This helps explain why some relationship dynamics repeat across different partners. The names change. The circumstances change. The beginning always feels new, yet the ending begins to look strangely familiar. The common denominator isn't bad luck alone. It's the unresolved pattern that quietly travels from one relationship into the next. Another important factor is the difference between missing a person and missing what the relationship provided. Those experiences are not always the same. Sometimes people grieve the individuals. Sometimes they grieve the stability, admiration, reassurance, or emotional certainty they associated with the relationship. Understanding that distinction matters because it changes how we interpret reconciliation attempts. A desire to reconnect doesn't automatically mean someone has developed greater empathy or accountability. It may simply reflect the loss of something that once helped them feel emotionally secure. Only sustained behavioral change can answer which motivation is actually present. This is why actions observed over time are far more informative than emotional conversations held in a single evening. Words describe intentions, patterns reveal habits, and habits are usually much harder to change than intentions. There is another consequence worth considering. When a highly empathic partner repeatedly responded with patience and understanding, they may have unintentionally created an unusually forgiving environment. After that relationship ends, future partners may respond very differently. Boundaries may be established earlier, contradictions may be questioned sooner. Emotional inconsistency may be met with distance instead of repeated reassurance. Someone accustomed to extraordinary patience may experience these healthier responses as rejection, when in reality they are simply expressions of ordinary relational boundaries. That difference can feel jarring, not because healthy boundaries are unkind, but because they differ from what the previous relationship had normalized. Over time, this can create frustration. The person may begin believing that people have changed. A more accurate explanation may be that the previous relationship contained an exceptional amount of emotional accommodation. Recognizing that difference requires humility. Without humility, it's often easier to conclude that everyone else is the problem. Perhaps the most significant turning point comes when someone asks a question they have been avoiding for years. Not, why did this relationship end? But, what kind of partner was I becoming while it existed? That question shifts attention away from winning the story and toward understanding it. It replaces blame with curiosity. It replaces image management with self-reflection. And that's often where meaningful psychological growth begins. Whether someone develops that curiosity depends on many factors: their willingness to examine themselves, the support they receive, and the choices they make after the relationship ends. The loss itself doesn't guarantee transformation, but it can create an opportunity for it. The opportunity, however, must be accepted. Otherwise, the same emotional patterns may simply reappear in different relationships, creating the impression that life keeps repeating the same lesson in different forms. And that brings us to the final part of today's discussion, because the greatest consequence of betraying someone who consistently offered patience and understanding may not be the end of the relationship itself. It may be missing the rare opportunity that relationship provided, the chance to confront long-standing patterns while someone was still willing to believe meaningful change was possible. The final piece of this discussion has very little to do with the breakup itself. It has everything to do with what happens afterward, because every significant loss eventually presents a choice. Not immediately, not while emotions are at their highest, but eventually. The choice is whether the experience becomes a mirror or simply another memory. A mirror asks difficult questions. What part of this pattern belongs to me? What kind of partner do I become when I'm afraid? What have I been avoiding seeing about myself? Those questions rarely produce comfortable answers, but they often produce growth. A memory, on the other hand, asks something very different. How do I stop feeling this as quickly as possible? That question isn't wrong. Everyone wants relief from emotional pain. The problem is that relief and resolution are not the same thing. Relief quiets uncomfortable emotions. Resolution changes the pattern that created them. Without resolution, the same dynamics often return wearing different faces. Different relationship, different beginning, remarkably familiar ending. This is one reason emotionally healthy relationships require more than attraction. They require self-awareness, not perfect self-awareness. No one has that, but enough honesty to recognize recurring patterns before they become recurring outcomes. There is another misconception worth addressing. Many people imagine that emotional collapse always looks dramatic. They picture constant sadness, visible regret, obvious suffering. Real life is often quieter than that. Sometimes the greatest consequence is not overwhelming emotion. It's emotional repetition, the same misunderstandings, the same arguments, the same inability to build lasting trust, the same sense that every relationship starts with hope but eventually reaches the same destination. When that cycle continues for years, the cost becomes much greater than one lost relationship. It begins limiting the possibility of experiencing genuine emotional intimacy. Healthy intimacy asks us to do something uncomfortable. It asks us to be known honestly, to admit mistakes without believing mistakes define our entire worth, to hear difficult feedback without immediately becoming defensive, to accept influence from another person without experiencing it as humiliation. Those capacities strengthen relationships over time. Without them, every disagreement risks becoming a threat rather than an opportunity for understanding. This is why accountability matters so much. Accountability isn't simply saying, "I was wrong." It's becoming curious about why the same situations keep producing the same outcomes. It's replacing self-protection with self-examination. That's difficult work, but it's also deeply human work. There is one final contrast worth noticing. The empath often spends the first chapter after the relationship grieving. They mourn what happened, they question themselves, they slowly rebuild trust in their own judgment. Over time, many discover stronger boundaries, greater discernment, and a clearer understanding of what healthy love requires. Their pain gradually becomes wisdom. The other person's path depends largely on what they choose to do with the loss. If they become willing to reflect honestly, painful experiences can become powerful teachers. If they continue avoiding self-examination, the loss may simply become another event explained away without changing the underlying pattern. The relationship itself does not determine the outcome. The response to the relationship does. Perhaps that's the most important idea to leave with today. The end of a relationship is not, by itself, evidence that one person grows while the other doesn't. Growth depends on the willingness to learn. It depends on accepting responsibility where responsibility exists. It depends on choosing insight over self-protection, even when insight feels uncomfortable. And that's true for everyone, regardless of personality, style, or relationship history. So if you were the person who was betrayed, Don't measure your healing by whether the other person eventually understands what they lost. That answer may never come. Instead, ask a different question. Has this experience made you wiser? Has it strengthened your ability to recognize healthy relationships? Has it taught you to value consistency over promises, accountability over charm, and mutual respect over emotional intensity? If the answer is yes, then something meaningful has already emerged from the pain. Because the greatest victory after betrayal isn't watching someone else's life fall apart. It's building a life that no longer depends on their choices for your peace. When that happens, the relationship stops being the defining chapter of your story. It simply becomes one chapter that helped shape the person you ultimately chose to become. And that is where genuine recovery begins, not in someone else's realization, but in your own. There is one more consequence that deserves attention because it unfolds so gradually that many people never recognize it while it's happening. Over time, every repeated choice becomes part of a person's identity. This is true for all of us. Every time we avoid a difficult conversation, it becomes slightly easier to avoid the next one. Every time we choose honesty despite discomfort, honesty becomes a little more natural. Human character is shaped less by dramatic moments than by ordinary habits repeated over months and years. This is why relationship patterns matter so much. They are never just isolated incidents, they become rehearsals. When someone repeatedly protects their image instead of protecting the relationship, that response slowly becomes automatic. Defensiveness no longer feels like a choice. Blame no longer feels intentional. Avoidance begins feeling completely normal because it has been practiced so many times. The opposite is equally true. Someone who repeatedly practices accountability gradually becomes less afraid of it. Admitting mistakes no longer feels like a threat to their identity. It becomes part of their identity. That difference changes every future relationship. Another reality worth considering is that trust is much easier to preserve than to rebuild. People often imagine trust as something strong because it lasts for years. In reality, trust behaves more like a living system. It grows through consistency. It weakens through repeated contradiction. And once deeply damaged, it requires extraordinary patience to restore. This is why moments of betrayal carry such lasting consequences. The betrayal itself may last only minutes. Its psychological impact can influence decisions for years. Not because people refuse to forgive, but because the nervous system remembers experiences that once felt emotionally unsafe. Healing eventually softens those memories. It doesn't erase them. Instead, it teaches us how to respond differently when similar situations appear again. Perhaps this is the quiet lesson hidden beneath every difficult relationship. Pain can make people more fearful, or it can make them more discerning. Fear closes the heart. Discernment protects it while allowing it to remain open. That is an important distinction. Healthy healing does not require becoming suspicious of everyone. It requires becoming attentive to patterns instead of promises. It requires recognizing that genuine trust grows slowly through repeated experiences, not through persuasive conversations. In the end, the most meaningful transformation belongs to the person who chooses awareness over repetition. Because once you understand your own patterns, you stop waiting for someone else to become different before your own life can move forward. You begin making decisions based on reality instead of potential. You stop confusing hope with evidence. And little by little, relationships become places where peace feels familiar instead of unpredictable. That quiet shift may not seem dramatic from the outside, but psychologically, it represents one of the greatest forms of freedom a person can experience. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from repeating the same pain over and over again.